Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, Chief Storymaker and your host of this podcast. We share stories for many reasons. We want to persuade, we want to entertain, and we want to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're sharing them with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding. And then we'll dig into lessons from each of those stories. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? Well, when I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, but not to respond necessarily. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Sitting here in my living room today with my mom, Ruth Elkins, and she's here visiting me in Montana from Sacramento, so I thought I'd take this opportunity to record a podcast with her about something that I think about a lot, which is our long-term impact on people that generally we don't know about, and sometimes we'll find out later on in life. So the first question I usually ask my guests is, tell me something about yourself that most people probably don't know. Something that most people that know you now wouldn't know about you from your past.
Well, most people don't realize that at 5 feet tall, I lettered in basketball. In those days, we had forwards and guards, and I was a guard. So I lettered in basketball, tennis, volleyball, swimming.
So you were quite an athlete.
I was.
Was that in high school?
It was in high school. I played field hockey, which they don't play on the West Coast at all.
And you grew up in Wilmington, Delaware.
Yes.
Was that your whole life? Were you born there?
I was born there, and I lived there till I was married, and then I lived all over the country.
Well, that I know about. And I just assumed you were born in Wilmington, Delaware, because that's something that I'd never really asked you before.
I was born in Wilmington, Delaware.
But Dad wasn't.
He was born in Florida.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's why.
Coral Gables.
Coral Gables, Florida.
Because his father was stationed there during World War II.
Wow. I have the best picture of my grandfather on Dad's side, my Zadie, of him sitting in his Navy pea coat with a pipe. And he was so handsome. I love that picture.
Yes, I do too.
But getting back to your athlete days, so there you were, 5'0", and you weren't even 5 feet yet in high school, right?
No, I was pretty close, like 4'11". But I was an unexpected force to contend with.
Especially in basketball.
Yes.
I knew about basketball, but I didn't realize that you had lettered in all those other athletics. Wow, yes. That's really cool. I thought I might learn something that I didn't know. Isn't that a great question?
In volleyball. I couldn't slam the balls, but I could set them.
Well, yeah, that's the best spot for a small person is right up against the net, so you can set the ball for a spiker.
And when I was playing basketball, everybody was so much taller than I. When they dribbled, I could swat the ball away from them to a teammate.
That makes so much sense. You're probably fast, too.
I was very fast, and I was a runner.
Wow. See, you must have been a little disappointed because none of your children ended up being athletes.
I was surprised. I was hoping to get somebody to run with me, and nobody would run with me when I was running. And now all of you have become athletic.
In some way or another.
In some way or another. You hike.
Mm-hmm. And camp and fish and kayak.
And your sister runs and works out all the time, and your brother is a fabulous snowboarder.
Yeah, super active as a snowboarder. And he goes to the gym almost every day when he's not, well, especially in the summertime when he's not out snowboarding.
Exactly.
Isn't that funny? I guess we just were on the wrong athletic tracks for what you
Oh, you're
did.
Late bloomers.
Well, I always hiked, though. I think there's part of that is also that as a parent, we see certain things like when we think of athlete, we think of our own experience of being an athlete. We don't think of athletics in terms of those activities outside of our experience. So since you weren't in an outdoorsy location, hiking wasn't necessarily an athletic thing. It wasn't. It was physical activity, but it wasn't what you would consider a sport.
A sport.
Yeah. So I was physical. I love to go out and hike. Remember, we used to do Stanley Canyon in Colorado
Yes,
Springs all
that's
the
true.
time. But sports, especially team sports, never appealed to me at all. I was never that competitive.
I was always out for after-school sports.
Yeah, isn't that funny? So let's get back to the theme of the podcast, which is when we have an impact with the words we say and the behaviors we demonstrate. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about this is that over the past 5 years, as I've been blogging more actively, and the last year of my podcast, because this is my 51st episode, we're almost to the 1 year mark. And a lot of what I write about are the lessons that I've learned over the years. And quite a few times, those stories have involved you and something you said or something you did that had a long-term impact that you probably didn't know. And you certainly didn't know at the time that what you said was going to stick with me for so long.
You never know what you say will resonate with someone, strike a nerve or whatever. I said a lot of things to you, but I never knew which would stick.
Right.
But I do have a story.
Okay.
About 5 or 6 years ago, your sister said something to me that absolutely stunned me. I said, Karen, that's what I used to say to you. She said, Mom, we were always listening, but you didn't know that.
Yes. Well, I think we've had that conversation before too. And the things that you think are so profound that you share, that you think about over the years, so many times those are not the things that we hear that resonate later on. And it's funny because especially at the time that you share that wisdom, that little drop, the nugget as I call it, it isn't necessarily going to resonate at that moment. It's later on when we look back and we think, oh yes, Mom said this, and this is why I do this way. And I'm taken right back to the story of when we were at camp together. It was my summer after my graduating year of high school, before I went to college, and you were the camp nurse. And it was such a hard summer. It was such a hard summer. I was treated really badly by the director. There were cliques of people who had gone to that camp as campers, worked their way up into counselor positions and administrative roles, and it was just a hard summer for me. And I almost quit midsummer. And I went into the infirmary where you were sitting, and you said, Sarah, you have to finish. And I said, they don't even want me here. I don't know why I have to stay. They're treating me so badly. Clearly, they want me to quit. And you said, if you leave now, you will not learn the lesson that you're here to learn. Because every struggle is a trial. And if you don't deal with it now, it's going to come back to you in a different form, but it's going to be the same basic issue. And I stuck it out. I stayed for the summer. It was miserable. But I remembered hearing you say, you have to learn this lesson or it's going to come back at you. And the last thing I wanted to do was have this lesson hit again. But the irony is that it wasn't until it hit again that I started to learn the lesson of what that summer was supposed to teach me, which had a lot to do with being aware of how you're being perceived by the people around you, and choosing, being intentional about how you want to be perceived through your behaviors and your actions. But it wasn't at that moment. I just needed to finish that particular trial. But do you even remember saying that to me?
Now that you bring it up, yes, because I had faced a couple trials. And the circumstances were different, but the lesson was the same. When I finally put it together, I was able to overcome that particular hurdle with the knowledge that there are other hurdles out there, and we keep meeting them until we learn to overcome whatever it is we need to overcome.
So tell me the story of that first hurdle that you realized that lesson, that this is a trial you needed to finish.
I was a brand new nurse, and I had a boss who had an attitude. We all have bosses like that. And I was thrilled to be a nurse, but I was unhappy in my job. But I didn't have the courage to go look for another job. And she retired or quit, I don't remember. She went to another position. And then there was another boss. And I realized I was having the same issues with the next boss. And I realized at that point, maybe it's not the boss, maybe it's me.
Oh, ouch.
Yes.
That's the worst.
Yes. So I made some internal changes and didn't have that hurdle again. All the rest of my bosses were great bosses. Through the years, I had bosses that weren't really so great, but I was able to manage myself so that I continued doing the work I loved and was able to function under those bosses that weren't so great. Because after time, you develop a knowledge of who's going to be great, who meets the needs of the employees, and who is only there to climb the ladder.
Mm-hmm. Or wait out their time until they can retire, which
exactly.
I see that a lot in the agencies that I've worked in over the years.
But I had a passion for what I was doing, and there was no way I was going to let someone else determine what I was going to do with my life. And I continued working at the position, I can't say job, I worked at the position that I was so passionate about and continued working there through thick and thin because it was something that I believed in, something I worked toward, and something that I reveled in. It was wonderful what I was doing. Mm-hmm. So it became up to me, not up to the boss.
So just for our listeners, a little history here. My mom, Ruth Elkins, is a nurse. She's an RN. She got her first degree in education and then realized in her late 30s that she's always wanted to be a nurse. So she went back to 4-year school with 3 teenagers at home and graduated summa cum laude and was a baby nurse. She wanted to be surrounded by babies, and she did that for almost 3 decades. So retired, 2 years ago this December, right? Or is it 3 now?
It's 3 now.
Oh my gosh. Time flies, right? So here's just one last thing about those things that people share with us that we take much longer to process and then absorb into our lives, those lessons that we hear. I always feel a little surprised and pleased when I hear somebody that from my past come up to me and say, do you remember when you told me this when I was struggling with whatever? And it's really made a difference for me, and I still think about it, and I hear your voice in my head every time I come across something like it. And I remember the last time this happened, it was Morgan, and she was our neighbor when we moved into this house 18 years ago. She was 8 years old, and she babysat for our 2 boys, and we became very, very close. And the last time I saw her, she brought up something like this, and I remember looking at her and wondering how she remembered it because I had no recollection of that conversation. But it made such an impact on her that a decade later, when she was about to go do something that was making her uncomfortable, she heard my voice in her head saying, you can do this. All evidence points to your competence in this area, so step out and go for it. And she told me this story, and of course, excuse me, of course, tears popped into my eyes because I was so touched by that. But it was almost painful because I had no recollection of that conversation. And I kind of wish I knew how wise I was at that moment because I feel like sometimes I'm going backwards in terms of wisdom. But so tell me one story about that happening to you when you realized, oh my gosh, that's so cool that I had that impact.
I did a lot of precepting for new nurses. And one of the greatest thrills for me was to have a nurse who had graduated from nursing school, got her bachelor's degree, came back to the same hospital and came to me and said, if it hadn't been for you and the way you precepted me, I might not be here today. Oh. Because you shared your wisdom with me.
Did she have anything specific or just the way that you did your work or?
She said that I was so willing to share all the knowledge I had. I had no desire to be better than or to rise above. I shared whatever knowledge I had and was happy to give her hints to make herself successful. And so, that was such an exciting moment for me.
I have such a bittersweet feeling about what she said to you because I know that there are people out there, particularly women, who will hold back information in the hopes to keep some level of power or control in a situation rather than sharing to improve the outcomes for the person that you're working with and training. So it's bittersweet to me because I'm sad that that still exists and it has always existed. And I've seen it happen in men as well, but I've seen it particularly with women. And I think it has to do with generationally, women had to work and really push in a way back, in 20, 30 years ago to get to where they wanted to be. And it didn't matter who was in their way. They had to do this to get to be successful. And I don't see that anymore, and not in the same way.
I'm encouraged that it's happening more and more. I do have one funny story to tell you about my training. I was going for my clinical one day while I was in college, and I went to the hospital floor that I was supposed to be in. I was with my instructor.
Just one sec. So clinical is when you're practicing when you're still in school.
When you're still in school.
Okay. But you're in the hospital.
I was in the hospital with my student uniform on and my student cap. They don't wear caps anymore. And we walked onto the floor, and a nurse turned around from the desk, and she looked and saw 5 students approaching the desk. She said, "Oh, students today? Oh, we don't have time. We're too busy. We can't have students today. It's just not a good day." And she was so angry. And guess who I was assigned to?
Her. Great.
It was a very tough day, and I tried to be as independent as possible because I didn't want to bother her. Right. But it wasn't a good learning day for me because I was already intimidated by the fact she didn't want me there. Mm-hmm. Fast forward 15 years later, I'm on the floor, just changed into my scrubs because we had to wear hospital scrubs where I worked. And I was coming around the corner where the elevator was, and what do I see? 8 or 10 students because we had a big unit. And I'm thinking, oh no, we're going to have students today. It's so busy. And I had the flashback. And I looked at the instructor and the students. I said, "Wow, am I glad to see you today. We are really busy. We're going to need a lot of help. And I'm really glad this is a good day for you to be here." And I'm not joking. 3 of the students turned around to see if I was talking to someone behind them.
Because they've had this experience before.
Yes. I thought, it's a good thing I had that memory because I was welcoming. And of course, they all wanted to be precepted under me.
Right, because you were warm and they actually thought they might learn something and not be underfoot.
I loved it.
Hilarious.
I loved precepting for that reason. Because I remembered how hard it was. Uh-huh. And I'm a born teacher. Yes. So it was wonderful doing head-to-toe assessments on babies with the students and asking them questions.
And helping
them see things that they wouldn't ordinarily see if somebody just did the procedure without talking to them. And that happened a lot.
Right, of course, because you were busy and it's easier just to do it yourself and get it done. But that doesn't serve the purpose of sustaining that work.
Exactly.
And doing it well. That's so funny. I love it when that happens, when we have those moments of, oh, I can't be like that person that was so mean to me.
It's a flashback. I wouldn't have said anything. Obviously, I wouldn't have said, "Oh no, it's students."
Right.
I would never say that.
But your expression would have told them everything.
It was a flashback. It's
what we don't say that usually people pick up on.
It was wonderful, and I learned a lesson that day too.
Yeah. You know what's awesome about that is I was just talking to somebody about being grateful for our struggles, and for me, it's really easy to be grateful for my struggles afterward, obviously not during the time. And I tried when I was struggling in a job a few years back. I tried to be grateful for that struggle, but there were so many tears and it was so hard that in that moment, sometimes I just wanted the struggle to be gone. But most of the time I could kind of recognize that I was learning lessons and how important they were. And I was also developing relationships in a different way because I would ask for help. I would ask for guidance, and I'd never done that before. I'm so independent, so fiercely independent that I rarely ask for help. But during this time, I was reaching out to people I respected and asking them for guidance. And so I was able to appreciate my struggle, even if I wasn't grateful for it at that moment. But what we were talking about yesterday was how we can be grateful for those people that put us through those struggles. and have, I guess, a warmth of thought about those people later on. And in that moment that you had that flashback, you may not have recognized this, but you had a sudden moment of gratitude to that woman that was so mean and abrupt, because you had this lesson, even though you didn't have a great learning day that day as being a clinical nurse, or doing your clinical, totally different thing. But you learned something from her, and I'll bet that somewhere in the back of your mind, when you had the image of that woman, it wasn't with anger. It was almost with a warmth and a gratitude. Do you think?
I remember the intimidation and feeling that we weren't welcome there, and that's what came back to me. And I didn't want these students to feel those feelings. I wanted them to know that they were on a path, they were on the path they were called to do, and that we needed to make it easier for them, not harder.
So it wasn't the nurse herself that you remembered, it was the feeling that you had.
That I had, and I didn't want to do that to the other students, because I was really underneath grateful to have students, because I needed somebody to replace me.
Right, when
I
you
retired.
Somebody that you could trust to take care of those babies.
And that's what I said to them.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I want you to be as good or better than I am in order to take care of these babies.
I'm trusting
when I can't
you
anymore. Right?
I'm trusting you.
See, that's so funny, because I always think in terms of a person. When I associate the feelings that I get about an event based on the person that was there at that moment. That's how I associate my lessons. And you were associating it just with the feelings that you had as a result. That's really interesting, and it's something I'm going to have to really
It was
process.
A defining moment for me.
Right, but it wasn't associated with a person. It was a defining moment based on your feelings. And that is a very different way to look at memories. And I'm going to have to think about how that plays out when I'm working with clients on helping them tell their stories, because it's so easy to project my own processing onto somebody else, and they do it differently. You're doing it differently than I do. That's fascinating. So the next thing, these people make a difference in our lives when they come to us and say that we made a difference. But the next part of this conversation is, there were so many things that you demonstrated to me that you didn't know at the time that you were demonstrating, that had very far-reaching impacts on my life. So, and I don't think, I think we associate words sometimes with lessons, but we don't realize that our behaviors are making much bigger impacts than our words. And when I saw you go back to school with 3 kids at home, and then you started working nights almost immediately upon graduation, I remember at that time feeling like it was kind of a hassle, because I ended up doing a lot of cooking and laundry and taking care of Karen and driving her around, because my sister's 5 years younger than I am, and I was in high school, so she didn't have a way to get around. And if you were sleeping after a night shift and Karen needed a ride to the orthodontist or whatever, I was the one that took up that slack, because Eric had his own life. He was a couple years older than I am. And I remember feeling like it was kind of a hassle, but I never blamed what you were doing on my feeling like I was putting in more work, because I knew that this was meaningful. And it wasn't until I went back to school for my master's degree with 2 little boys at home that I realized that that was what influenced me to go back to school, was watching you do what you did.
Wow.
But you didn't tell me what you were doing. We didn't talk about it. You didn't say, I'm going back to school because this is what's going to be meaningful to me, and I want to be able to play with babies all day long. You didn't tell me why you were going back.
Well, actually, I didn't play with babies, but I was surrounded by them.
Yes. Well, you got to touch them and hold them and make sure they were okay. But I remember that you didn't talk about why you were doing it, but I saw your devotion to it. I saw your commitment, your motivation, the ambition that you had. That's what I was witnessing. And that's what inspired me to do it later.
Wow, that's wonderful.
So it's always your actions, again, when you're demonstrating it. So can you think of somebody that did that for you, that you saw somebody doing that and it inspired you later on? Or not that necessarily, but some other action that they might not have told you about?
One of the things that was modeled for me when I was 8 years old, my older sister was almost 12 years older, and she was married. She had a baby, and she began to breastfeed that baby. And in the 50s, 1950s, nobody breastfed because it was a sign of poverty and disadvantage. People breastfed because they couldn't afford formula. I didn't know all that, but it came to light later. But she was breastfeeding my very first nephew, who was just a joy. And I thought, how cool is that? I didn't know you could do that. I was 8 years old. Shortly afterwards, my aunt had a baby. She was a few years younger than my sister. And she brought the baby over to show my mother. And I was so excited. I said, "Are you breastfeeding?" And she says, "Oh, no, honey, that's dirty."
Oh,
And
the 50s.
all of a sudden, I realized that my sister wouldn't do anything that would be harmful or dirty for her baby. And I realized that maybe this aunt didn't have all the information or was exposed in a bad way. I couldn't console myself with the fact that I loved this aunt and the fact that she said it was dirty that my sister would do anything that would harm her baby. My role model was to breastfeed my children because I saw that it was really a great way to raise a child. When I had my first baby, who was very ill, meconium aspiration, I don't know if anybody understands that.
Well, I can put a link to it in the blog post
Okay.
associated with the podcast so people understand what that means.
The doctor and nurses say we hope he makes it.
Oh.
I couldn't do anything to help him, but somebody suggested I pump because I had talked about breastfeeding. And the doctor even came to me and said, don't even consider breastfeeding because he's going to be in the hospital for a long time. And what he didn't tell me is what he told your dad was, we don't expect him to live. But at that time, La Leche League was available, and I went to a couple meetings. Somebody got me hooked up with a breast pump, and I actually succeeded in breastfeeding your brother after 3 weeks of hospitalization.
Wow.
I had a role model and somebody who made it seem like that was the only thing to do to really make a healthy, happy baby. So I was successful with that because my sister was my role model. And I have to tell you, I tell her frequently what a wonderful big sister she was to show me not just that, but many other things.
So she knows that that in particular influenced your life in a very big way.
Yes.
And
So I became a lactation consultant.
I knew that you were big into La Leche League and had become a lactation consultant. As a matter of fact, for our listeners, my mom has helped multitudes of women be able to breastfeed that wanted to breastfeed and could have the capacity to breastfeed. And a lot of my friends and my sister's friends have called her after having babies, and she has done video chats with people and helped them be successful in breastfeeding, which is really, I find that to be pretty inspiring. So when you told Aunt Judy that in particular was a big influence on you, did she say anything like, I was just doing it because it seemed right? Or
she was delighted that it made such an impression on me, and that I told her what my aunt had said, and she laughed. She said it's nature's way to make sure you have a healthy baby because breast milk has stuff just for babies. Cow's milk has stuff just for calves. So, but she was delighted. And I need to tell her again how it changed my life because it made me an advocate for women who had been told that they probably couldn't breastfeed, and we were able to do workarounds. There are physical issues that prevent some women from breastfeeding, but I was able to make many women feel just as motherly by giving them suggestions and helping them around the breastfeeding issue. For example, nothing makes me sadder than to see a person bottle feeding a baby in a stroller. And I once said, if babies were meant to be fed in a stroller, breasts would be removable. And these women who could not breastfeed, I said, hold your baby, snuggle your baby, and hold the baby close while you feed him or her. Don't prop a bottle because you can't prop a breast, and behave like you're breastfeeding. It's a wonderful substitute to give that baby the security he needs to feel or she needs to feel. And I was able to work around and make many women feel that they were successful, even though they couldn't breastfeed for various reasons.
And that's because it came with no judgment. And that is definitely something Aunt Judy has always passed along, even to me, is that she didn't judge. If you did something differently, it wasn't a judgment. She would definitely observe. She'd let you know she noticed. But it never came across to me as judgment, where some other family members, it always felt like judgment. It felt like criticism. But with Aunt Judy, it always just felt like she was curious. And that's the thing about Aunt Judy that she has modeled for me for decades, is her sense of curiosity. She's constantly learning. She's constantly opening her eyes and reading. I mean, even at, how old is she? 82 now?
Yes.
82. And she emails us things, interesting articles that she's read. Her sense of curiosity and wonder, she's like a child. And I don't know anyone else who's quite like that. And that's what she models for me.
That's great to know.
I love her. And she's funny. She's very funny. Wow. Yeah, it's funny. I think it's really important that we recognize that whatever we're doing, we're modeling. And when you're working with these moms, new moms, you're modeling that, and you're demonstrating that lack of judgment and the ability to do something that they might otherwise have given up on. So, and that always fits back into the stories that we tell ourselves, which is when a woman wants to breastfeed and can't, I know that it's really hard sometimes. They have this internal message of failure. And especially because there's so many things about motherhood that we make assumptions about. A good mother breastfeeds, or a good mother does this, or a good mother does that. And we start judging ourselves so quickly after that baby is born. And even beforehand, I shouldn't have this sip of wine. I shouldn't have had that glass of beer, or I shouldn't be eating this chocolate or drinking this coffee. And we start judging ourselves. And what you did by providing that conversation and allowing them to be successful in a different way without judgment can change that internal message for them about what a good mother looks like.
Thank you.
It's kind of magical. Well, you have that effect on a lot of people, that ability to help people not judge themselves and understand that they can be successful doing something in a different way. But you've modeled that as well for me over the years. I always remember when we were children, and our holiday of Purim, which is a Jewish holiday where we celebrate, again, that somebody tried to annihilate all the Jews, and we managed to survive, and then we celebrate with food and stories and music. And the tradition for Purim is to make cookies that are shaped in the shape of a hat that the villain wore at the time, Haman, and the cookies are called Hamantaschen, and to eat dried nuts and fruits. I'm not sure where that comes from, and maybe I'll look that up and associate it with a link in the blog with this podcast. But I remember when we lived in Colorado Springs and we were little, and you would bake these cookies. We would bake cookies together, and we would get these baskets together, and we'd play a version of Ding Dong Ditch, where you would have one of us run the basket up to the door of a friend or a neighbor. Particularly, I remember Sarah and Nate Helpman, who were Holocaust survivors. And I remember dropping it off on their door and ringing the doorbell and running away so they wouldn't see me dropping it off. And you said, run quick, they're not supposed to see you. And I remember getting in the car and looking out the window, and Sarah had opened the door and Nate had come up behind her. And I remember her smiling and waving, and I ducked my head down because they weren't supposed to see me. And they waved, and the next time we saw them at synagogue, Sarah came up to me and gave me the warmest hug. And I still have the gift they gave me from my bat mitzvah a few years after that. And they didn't live much longer after that. So that is a very fond memory. And again, you didn't tell me we're doing this because it's a nice thing to do. You didn't lecture me about why we were doing what we were doing. You were modeling something that I have taken with me for decades, obviously. And I do things like that with our boys. And I think about that, what we're modeling, what kind of behavior, what kind of generosity we're modeling for our children without having to use words. Because the words don't mean anything without the action behind them. Okay, one more story.
Uh-oh.
I was thinking about when you moved across the country, when you and Dad divorced, and you were working in Sacramento, and you had found an apartment, furnished apartment, and you loaded up your black Tempo. And you were driving across the country. You had to put chains in the car. I remember that. So tell me about what you thought you were doing at that time. Like what, because again, you didn't know what you were modeling for me.
Well, it was a very painful period of my life. We do have those, the roller coaster of life. I felt that I was abandoning my children, but I had to survive so I could be there for my children. And I was escaping an environment that was not healthy for me.
It's really toxic. Mm-hmm.
And I do remember crying all the way across country from Denver to Sacramento. I had a job waiting for me. But I was demonstrating survival, I guess, because I had to start over again. I think the most important thing I showed my children was that you can pick yourself up through adversity. They always felt loved. Mm-hmm. They never felt abandoned, but I felt like I was abandoning them. You and Eric were already in college, and Karen was staying home with your dad. Mm-hmm. I couldn't bring her with me because I was working night shift, and I didn't want to leave her alone for 12 hours at night, 3 nights a week. I felt that she needed more supervision than that.
Which we found out later she certainly did.
Yes.
And more than Dad could give her.
But at least somebody was there with her.
Right.
I always regretted having to leave, but then I discovered through storytelling from my children that in doing what was best for me was actually best for them, because they could see the progression of my life and going from dependence to independence, and from my growth as a person to be a better mom. And I was able to give my children more of myself once I was stable, because being unstable, it's a matter of survival. And I couldn't give more to my children until after I was in a better place.
That is a huge lesson in so many ways. I mean, first of all was you have to care for yourself before you can care for others. You have to love yourself. You have to have that confidence in yourself before you can have confidence in others. And that you can stand up for yourself. That was the biggest lesson for me when you left, was this is really important. That to me you modeled, I'm not going to tolerate being treated badly. It's just not going to happen. I'm done. And that, when I was dating, that was something I really paid attention to. I broke up with people all the time on one little thing that I would notice that indicated that I wasn't being respected, that I wasn't being treated with respect and kindness. And it would be the first date, the second date, I would notice these little things. I would test men who would take me out to dinner by how they behaved toward the waitresses. Or I would ask them a question about their mother or their sister. And if there was any indication that they were disrespectful toward the women in their lives, I would stop. I would never go out with them again. And that was partly because of how you modeled that. Like, I'm not gonna tolerate that, just like my mom didn't tolerate it. So tell me about when you finally noticed, or I guess not noticed, when you processed that reality that your children didn't resent what you did, that you had, was there one situation or conversation you had with one of us that you realized, oh, thank goodness, that's how they saw that?
Well, I wasn't totally aware of that at any particular time, but watching my children grow and seeing the lessons they learned from my trials was enough. But I did have a situation with Karen. She told me, and we've talked about this since, how she was angry that I left her with Dad because she and he were not getting along. And I had to feel the guilt of leaving her there. But then I realized it was better for her to have supervision than not to have supervision where I was going in my life. And a few years later, after Karen was in college, she came to me and told me, you know, Mom, I know I resented it when you left, but I'm so glad I had that time alone with Dad because I learned about my father and I was able to work with him, and it taught me life's lessons in handling myself with people who could be unreasonable.
Which he could.
He could. And she said that I'm grateful for the time we had together.
Oh, that must have been such a relief.
It was such a relief for me because it was really a tough time for me leaving
I know.
the youngest one.
I know.
But she was almost finished high school, so it wasn't like I was leaving her for years and years and years.
Right.
It was only a matter of less than 18 months that she was going to have to manage to live with her dad.
Well, and she needed that time. I mean, she acknowledged it. The fact that she just a few years later understood the lessons that she was able to learn because you did that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she was not trustworthy, and she said she wasn't.
No, she
Not
definitely wasn't.
Not at that age.
What's funny is that I was at that age. I lost my trustworthiness later in life. I found it again, but man, I went through some years where
We all do.
I just wish it had been, younger, so the consequences weren't so severe.
We all have our own path to
Yes.
follow, and we don't know what's going to jump in front of us on that path.
That's for sure. And there were some things that really positive things that Dad modeled for me. One of the things that I always think about was how kind and charming he was with every single human being he met.
Yes.
It didn't matter if he was always an executive in the printing world when I knew what he did. And he talked to the janitor, the maintenance folks, in the same tone as he talked to his peers and colleagues. He never was rude or dismissive to any human being in my experience. Whether we were at a restaurant or in the printing plant or hot air ballooning with crew who didn't know what they were doing, he was always just curious about them, and he just seemed to believe in the value and humanity of every person he came across.
And the other thing about your dad, it takes sometimes two to raise, well, it takes a village, really.
Right.
But he always showed you his love.
Right.
There was never any doubt with the three of you that we didn't love you.
Oh, absolutely. No matter what the dynamics in the household, no matter the stress or the frustration that was going on around his work, we never had a doubt about our loving household. Even when there was yelling going on in the household, we knew we had the foundation set that we were loved, cherished. It's so funny. I have to just backtrack a little with that word. it was my cousin Melissa who used that word when we were talking about boys we were dating. And I said, oh, I just can't keep interest in anyone. I'm just dating. And she said, you'll know the right guy when he cherishes you. And I remember vomiting a little in my mouth when she said that, because the word cherish just upset me, because it was Cool in the Gang. Cherish, that song was just an awful, awful song. It was so cheesy. So when she used that word, I just rolled my eyes. But it wasn't until later, when I met Bob, my husband, that I understood what she meant by that word. Because when we started dating, every morning that we woke up together, he would bring me coffee in bed. That's how I would wake up, was coffee delivered to me in bed, because I don't like getting up in the morning. And he knew that. And even 20 years into our relationship, he still brings me coffee in bed. And that's what cherished means to me.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah, I'm lucky. I know. I don't take it for granted. Mom, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. This was such a treat. And
thank you. It's an honor for me to be on your program.
It's kind of neat, isn't it?
It is. It's fun. I'm glad you found your passion.
I did. It took me a long time, a little longer than it took you, but there's something about sharing these stories that brings us closer together, and it's not always a good thing to share certain stories, and there are definitely downsides to it, and that's something maybe I'll talk about in another podcast sometime. But thank you so much for joining me. I love you, Mom.
I love you, sweetie.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?